Once again, ladies and gents, you'll find this portion of the video slightly different from the analysis that comes after, because I'm actually filming this, the reading of the Damnation game, some weeks after I've actually done the filming of the actual analysis. It's the way things are working out at the moment. Anyway, the Damnation game. He had to see, or if seeing wouldn't do, what was seeing anyway? Mere sensuality, then he would learn a new way of knowing. That was the promise the room whispered in his ear, a new thing to know and a way of knowing it. He pulled himself up the banisters, hand over hand, less and less aware of the pain as he climbed to the buzzing darkness. He wanted so much to take the ghost train ride. There were dreams in there he'd never dreamt, would never have a chance to dream again. Blood squelched in his shoe. He laughed at it. A spasm had begun in his leg. He ignored it. The last steps were ahead. He climbed them with steady work. The door was ajar. He achieved the summit of the stairs and limped towards it. Marty had never understood until now. He'd been a virgin, living in a world innocent of this deep and exhilarating penetration, not simply of body, of mind too. The air in the room closed around his head as soon as he stepped into it. The plates of his skull seemed to grind against each other. The voice of the room, no longer needing its whispered tones, shouted in his brain, "So, you came. Of course you came. Welcome to Wonderland." He was dimly aware that it was his own voice that was speaking these words. It had probably been his voice all along. He had been talking to himself like a lunatic. Even though he'd now seen through the trick, the voice came again, lower this time. This is a fine place to find yourself in, don't you think? At the question, he looked around. There was nothing to see, not even walls. If there were windows in the room, they were hermetically sealed. Not a chink of the outside world belonged in here. "I don't see anything," he murmured in reply to the room's boast. The voice laughed. He laughed with it. "Nothing here to be frightened of," it said. Then, after a smirking pause, "Nothing here at all." And that was right, wasn't it? Nothing at all. It wasn't just darkness that kept him sightless, it was the room itself. He glanced giddily over his shoulder. He could no longer see the door behind him, even though he knew he had left it open when he came in. There should have been at least a glimmer of light from downstairs spilling into the room, but that illumination had been eaten up, as was his torchlight. A smothering grey fog pressed so close to his eyes that even if he lifted his hand up in front of him, he could see nothing. "You're all right here," the room soothed him. "No judges here, no bars here." "Am I blind?" he asked. "No," the room replied. "You're seeing truly for the first time." "I don't like it." "Of course you don't, but you'll learn, in time. Living's not for you. Ghosts of ghosts, the living are. You want to lie down, be done with that caper. Nothing's essential, boy. I want to leave. Would I tell you lies? I want to leave, please. You're in safe hands. Please." He stumbled forward, confused as to which way the door was, in front or behind. Arms spread before him like a blind man on a cliff edge, he reeled, looking for some point of security. This wasn't the adventure he'd thought it would be. It was nothing. Nothing is essential. Once stepped into, this boundless nowhere had neither distance nor depth, north nor south, and everything outside it, the stairs, the landing, the stairs below that, the hallway, Caris, all of it was like a fabrication. A dream of palpability, not a true place. There was no true place but here. All he'd lived and experienced, all he'd taken joy in, taken pain in, it was insubstantial. Passion was dust, optimism, self-deception. He doubted now even the memory of senses, the textures, the temperatures, colour, form, pattern, all diversions, games the mind had invented to disguise this unbearable zero. And why not? Looking too long into the abyss would madden a man. The Damnation game. The Damnation game. We're into it now. This is where Barker's career really starts to swell and take off. This is where he starts doing the big, dense, heavily mythological stuff. This is the kind of work that people tend to remember Barker for, more so than his shorter stuff, like the novellas, like Cabal, like Books of Blood, that kind of thing. It's the big, weighty, dense stories that people regard as classically Barkerian, the ones that have a very dense mythology about them, and that are quite elaborate. I mean, he's very good, certainly at this stage, he's very good at creating very detailed metaphysical mythologies and then slowly revealing them as the narrative goes on. He's got that very particular knack of revealing just enough, so that it's naturally peppered throughout the narrative, rather than just being given to you in a big glut or being expressed through exposition, which is always fucking death. I mean, Dan Brown, good God, how that guy ever got published, I don't know. How he became the phenomenon he is, I don't know, because he is just awful. That's how Dan Brown works when he writes. His characters just talk about the plot and the back mythology for pages on end. But this is a very good example of how to do it really, really well. The Damnation game it's a very good entry point, actually. I found, rereading it, it's a very good entry point for people who perhaps like horror, but like more, I don't want to say standard, but more traditional horror, I suppose. More sort of like Stephen King flavour horror, which tends to be more, it tends to operate more along traditional lines than Barker's work does. Barker's always straddled this very unusual intersection, or this cross section of genres, where it's not quite fantasy, it's not quite horror, it's not quite science fiction, it's not quite metaphysical fantasy. It's all of these things and none of them all at once. And the Damnation game is a very good example of that, but it's also the most sedate of the books that Barker's written to date, in the sense that it is very redolent of fiction of the era, of horror fiction of the era. You would not be surprised to find this on a shelf alongside Stephen King's works, or even Perish the Thought, the awful Dean Koontz, or any number of Ramsey Campbell, or any number of luminaries from not that Dean Koontz is a luminary. The others are. He's not. He's an awful writer. And not a very nice guy by all accounts. But you would not be surprised to find this on a bookshelf alongside those figures, because it is very redolent of that kind of fiction, the sort of mid to late 80s, early 90s horror fiction, which was very, very popular, very significant. It doesn't entirely follow the same patterns or the same tropes, but it is redolent of them. And although it does include everything you'd expect from a Barker story, it has the weirdness, it has the very ambiguous characters, not only the protagonists but the antagonists as well. It's more down the line, I think. This is the book I would give to someone who hasn't read Barker before and perhaps isn't as familiar with his type of fiction. This is a very good way of easing people in, because it is more sedate. It's certainly more sedate than everything that comes after it. It's more sedate than Weave World, or than Imagica, or the Books of the Art, whose weirdness is fairly early on in the narrative and just explodes everywhere and just keeps getting weirder and weirder and weirder. This one actually starts out quite sedately. Like a lot of Barker's books. Barker's fiction from this era they're all structured in very similar ways. You've got the setup of a kind of mythology, of a backstory, and then a shift to another place and time, and characters who are not involved in that mythology being drawn into it. It's a very familiar template in many respects, but it's just handled very well. Barker does this very good thing where he can establish a mythology very fluidly and very naturally, and then shift away from it and introduce you to a whole new set of characters who usually end up being the main protagonists of the story. They are discovering what you've already had a taste of. It's not what you already know as the reader, but what you've had a taste of, and that's certainly the case here. I mean, this book starts in World War II Warsaw, shortly after the German occupation. And there's a vague character who you only know as the thief. You only know him as the thief at this point, who is making out like a bandit. He's loving this. He's having a very good war. He is able to con or to gamble his way into anything, and as a result is doing very, very well, until he encounters this semi-mythological figure, this card player, who has this status whereby people are afraid of him. His name is Mamoulian, and he calls himself the European. In fact, he calls himself, is it the first European? The Aboriginal, which is intriguing in and of itself, who seems to have some sort of supernatural capacity with the cards. And all you know is that this card player invites the thief to a game, and the thief accepts. He goes. Whether he wins or not, you don't know, because the narrative then switches very quickly to another character, Marty Strauss, who is the protagonist of the story, and through which most of the story, most of the story is filtered through his perspectives. Who is an ex-con who's in jail for a robbery that went hideously wrong and ended up with someone being murdered. And this is a very good example of the kinds of characters Barker paints. He can create very ambiguous and fairly unpleasant characters. I mean, Marty's he is sympathetic, but he's not entirely. He is an ambiguous character like all of them. He has his moments. He's not wholly pleasant at all. In fact, he is often kind of stupid and kind of crude, and thinks more with his fists than with his brain at times. But you get to like him. He's also kind of charming and kind of pleasant, and you get to like him. And for reasons unknown to himself, a man named Joseph Whitehead, who is this incredible magnate, this industrialist he's sort of like Donald Trump if Donald Trump were charming. He owns all sorts of companies and factories. He is like an emperor of the world, essentially. He's very much a 1980s figure. That figure of material aspiration that Barker fucking loathes. I mean, Barker loathes these characters. They turn up a lot in his fiction, and they are often villains, and they often get hideously done by. Whitehead's a little bit different. He's not actually that bad. He's not a nice guy by any stretch of the imagination, but he is charming. And like all the characters in this book, he's actually kind of ambiguous. You kind of like him and you don't like him. He's simultaneously decent and a cunt. He's a cool character. He's a very interesting character, but he, for whatever reason, orchestrates Marty's release. He employs Marty as a bodyguard around his estate. There's something going on. You don't quite know what, but he's afraid. He's an industrialist. He has enemies, and he is terribly, terribly afraid. Of course, what you find is that he is the thief from the beginning of the story, and the person coming to get him is not like some industrial assassin. It's Mamoulian, this figure, this character who is beautifully rendered. He's beautifully rendered. Mamoulian is this ancient, weary figure. Initially he appears as supernatural, and he is supernatural. He has some amazing capacities. He can create illusions. He can worm his way into other people's minds and make them do things. And he can also, his most repellent capacity is that he can lend people life. He can resurrect the dead, regardless of what state they're in, and that leads to some of the more hideous, truly vile imagery in this book. There's a character called Anthony Bria, who is disgusting from the get-go. He's this serial killer and child abuser who regards himself as the last of some mythical tribe called the Razor Eaters. It's something he's made up in his own mind. And when you first meet him, he's killing himself. He is hanging himself from the light fixture in his flat. But Mamoulian comes along and seemingly saves him to help him get what he wants as a sort of strong arm and bodyguard. However, as the book progresses, Bria starts to notice some odd things. He starts to notice that he's sort of stinking a little bit, and flies are attracted to him, and that his bowels don't work, and that there's odd feelings rumbling around inside of him, and he is essentially dead. And Mamoulian is suspending him just so far as he needs him. And by the end of the story, he is this rotten, cadaverous thing. And the state that he's in is so graphically drawn, it's unreal. But this is the kind of thing Mamoulian can do. But he doesn't want to kill Whitehead. Mamoulian is so ambiguous, so ambiguous. He is such a human character for all of his flaws. He's lived for such a long time that he's expended every appetite. He does not. He regards fleshly appetite with a kind of patrician weariness and a certain disgust. He's ascetic. He's purged himself of appetite. What he used to do, by all accounts, is live vicariously through his friends, through people like Joseph Whitehead. He used to experience things vicariously through them. But he doesn't even do that anymore. He's just weary. He's just tired. He's tired of living. He's tired of being. And what he wants, the bargain he made with Whitehead, ultimately, what he wants is for Whitehead to go with him. He wants his friend to go with him into death and the unknown, because Mamoulian doesn't know what's there. And that's brilliant. That's a wonderful tension. Because what it ultimately means is Mamoulian is just asking for what he was promised. He's not the bad guy here as such, although he does do some terrible things in pursuit of Joseph Whitehead. Whitehead reneged on the bargain after getting all of his fortune and whatnot. Whitehead reneged on the bargain. So it's hard to say who the real villain is here. It really is. And Mamoulian's really interesting. You kind of feel sorry for him. Certainly by the end of the book, he's sad and he's weary and he's had enough. He's lived for so long, he's had enough, and he's just afraid. He's terribly, terribly afraid. He comes from up here being this incredible supernatural force to being really pitiable by the end. And that's a very, very clever trick to pull. It's a very clever stunt to pull. Meanwhile, you have Marty, who's sort of floundering around in this situation, not really knowing what to do, not knowing whether he should help Whitehead, whether he should just deliver him for his own sake. You have these conflicting loyalties all the way through, and these turning, twisting, transforming perceptions and positions, which again is very, very Barkerian and very untypical of the horror fiction of the era, because very often in the fiction of the era you've got very standard characters. It's like the bully characters in Stephen King, and don't get me wrong, I like a lot of Stephen King's work, not all of it, but there are certain tropes that turn up again and again and again and again and again, and sometimes they're wearisome. I mean, a lot of King's books have the bully characters who are really boring and dull because they're not fleshed out beyond the fact that they are just bullies and they're just dicks. You have characters who are sympathetic and remain sympathetic, characters who are unsympathetic and remain unsympathetic, and that's it. You don't get that here. You just have these conflicting positions, and ultimately Marty's place is defined by what's her name? Clarice Whitehead, I believe, who is Caris, not Clarice, Caris Whitehead, who is Joseph's daughter. Joseph's daughter, who has similar capacities to Mamoulian, which is interesting. It's not stated outright, but it's suggested that maybe there's a little bit of Mamoulian in her, that somehow when she was conceived, maybe Mamoulian was present in Joseph's head, partaking vicariously, and some of that is in her. Fascinating, very, very interesting stuff. And again, a very complex character, not the victim character as such. She's actually a heroin addict who is by turns sympathetic and hateful. It's very, very difficult to tell as the reader where your loyalties lie in this book. There's a nihilism and a dirt and a grit about it. And by the end, that nihilism is conflated to the nth degree. Even a character like Mamoulian, who knows something of what lingers after death, who knows something of metaphysics, is this despairing individual who is afraid all the time. And that's it's sort of redolent of Barker's own perspectives at this time. This is before the grand metaphysics of Imagica or of Weave World. This is when Barker was far more atheistic in his outlook and far more sort of atomistic, I suppose. There was a darkness and a nihilism to Barker's perspectives when he was writing this book, and it comes through. There is a sort of patina of dirt on every page, which is kind of wonderful. It's something that I really look for in horror fiction. And not that sense of being soiled for being in this world. And it's a wonderful thing for any work of horror to do, but something which not many do. There is too much of a polish to them. There's too much cleanliness. There's too much absolutism. This doesn't give you that. And if you haven't read Clive Barker before, but you think you might enjoy his work, very, very good entry point indeed, especially if you're more familiar with more traditional horror fiction. Now, what is next? I believe next is the big one. Next. Oh, no, wait. Yes, the next one is the big one. The next one is Weave World. That is going to be quite a big video, I imagine. And it's going to be probably quite emotional, because Weave World is one of the most significant books I've ever read, certainly to me personally. So, until then.